In the shadow of Troy's towering walls, where the clash of bronze and the screams of the fallen filled the air, a tale has been buried for millennia, whispered only in fragments by those who dared defy the gods and kings. This is not the story of Achilles' wrath or Hector's valor, but of a warrior whose name was erased, whose deed shook the Achaean camp, and whose fate was sealed by betrayal. Her name was Lysaea, a woman of the Myrmidons, and her story begins in the 10th year of the siege, when hope among the Greeks had withered like leaves in a drought. The Achaean camp sprawled along the shore, a city of tents and driftwood palisades, stinking of sweat, blood, and unburied dead. Agamemnon, high king of the Greeks, ruled from his great pavilion, his pride as unyielding as the Trojan walls. The war had ground into a stalemate, with raids and skirmishes yielding little but corpses. The Trojans, emboldened by their unbreached defenses, struck at the Greek lines under cover of night, their arrows raining like vipers from the darkness. It was a time of desperation, when men muttered of curses and the gods' abandonment. Lysaea was no ordinary soul in this chaos. Born in a fishing village on the rocky shores of Phthia, she had grown among the Myrmidons, Achilles' fierce tribe. Her father, a spearman who fell in a forgotten skirmish, had taught her to wield a blade before she could weave. Her mother, a healer, whispered of Artemis, the huntress goddess, who favored those who defied fate. Lysaea was lean and wiry, her skin weathered by sun and salt, her dark hair cropped short beneath a bronze helm. She was no beauty by the standards of poets, but her eyes burned with a fire that made men step aside. Disguised as a youth, she had joined the Myrmidons, her skill with spear and shield earning her a place among Achilles' elite. The Myrmidons were restless that year, their leader Achilles withdrawn in his tent, nursing his feud with Agamemnon over the captive Briseis. Without their champion, the Greeks faltered, and Lysaea's unit was tasked with guarding the camp's northern flank, a stretch of dunes and scrub where Trojan raiders struck most often. It was here, under a moonless sky, that the event unfolded that would seal her legend and her doom. The night was heavy with the stench of pitch and salt. Lysaea crouched behind a driftwood barricade, her spear balanced across her knees. Her comrades, grizzled men with scars like maps, muttered prayers to Ares. The wind carried the faint clink of armor from beyond the dunes, and Lysaea's heart quickened. She hissed a warning, and the Myrmidons readied their shields. Moments later, a wave of Trojan warriors crested the ridge, their bronze-tipped spears gleaming faintly in the starlight. They were led by a giant of a man, his helm adorned with a serpent crest, his war cry a bellow that chilled the blood. The fight was swift and savage. Lysaea drove her spear through a Trojan's chest, her movements precise, her strength honed by years of survival. The Myrmidons held the line, but the Trojans fought with desperate ferocity, their numbers swelling as more poured from the shadows. Lysaea saw a gap in the defenses, where a band of Trojans broke through, racing toward the heart of the camp. Without orders, she pursued, her breath ragged, her sandals pounding the sand. The raiders' target was clear, Agamemnon's pavilion, its banners fluttering faintly in the distance. The High King, roused from sleep, stood at the entrance, his golden armor half donned, his guards forming a thin line. The Trojans descended like wolves, their blades hacking through the guards' shields. Agamemnon swung his sword, but he was no match for the onslaught. A Trojan spearman lunged, his weapon aimed at the king's heart. It was Lysaea who acted. She hurled her spear with a cry that split the night, the bronze tip piercing the spearman's throat. He fell, gurgling, and Lysaea drew her short blade, leaping into the fray. She fought like a demon, her movements a blur, cutting down 2 more raiders before they could reach Agamemnon. Her shield splintered under a Trojan axe, but she seized a fallen spear and drove it through the attacker's chest. The surviving raiders fled, their cries fading into the dark. Agamemnon stood, blood-splattered, his chest heaving. His eyes met Lysaea's, and for a moment, there was gratitude in his gaze. The Myrmidons arrived, their cheers echoing as they hailed her as a hero. Word of the deed spread through the camp by dawn, men whispering of the young warrior who had saved the High King. But Lysaea felt no triumph. She knew the truth of her disguise, and in the Achaean world, a woman's valor was a dangerous secret. As the sun rose, staining the sky red, Agamemnon summoned Lysara to his pavilion. She stood before him, her helm removed, her cropped hair damp with sweat. The king's face was unreadable, his counselors murmuring behind him. Among them was Calchas, the seer, whose eyes narrowed as he studied her. The air was thick with tension, and Lysara's heart pounded like a war drum. She had saved the king, but she sensed a storm brewing, one that would test her more than any battle. Inside Agamemnon's pavilion, the air was heavy with incense and the weight of power. The high king sat on a throne of carved cedar, his golden armor gleaming in the torchlight. His counselors flanked him, their faces a mix of awe and suspicion. Lysara stood alone, her spear left outside, her shield arms still aching from the night's battle. She felt the eyes of the men boring into her, as if they could peel away her disguise and expose the truth beneath her bronze and leather. Agamemnon spoke first, his voice deep and measured. He praised her courage, calling her deed a gift from Athena herself. The counselors nodded, but Lysara saw the unease in their glances. Calchas, the seer, stepped forward, his robes rustling like dry leaves. His voice was soft, yet it carried a venom that made her skin prickle. He spoke of omens, of a woman's presence in the camp bringing the gods' wrath. Lysara's blood ran cold. She had heard tales of Calchas' visions, how they bent kings to his will, how they justified bloodshed. The seer's words planted a seed of doubt. Agamemnon's gratitude wavered, his eyes narrowing as he studied Lysara. She stood taller, her jaw set, refusing to shrink under their scrutiny. But the damage was done. Whispers spread beyond the pavilion, carried by soldiers and slaves, twisting her heroism into a threat. By midday, the camp buzzed with rumors. The warrior who saved the king was no man, but a woman, a curse disguised as a savior. Lysara returned to the Myrmidons' tents, her comrades' cheers now tinged with suspicion. Some slapped her back, calling her a hero, but others kept their distance, their eyes averted. Her captain, a grizzled man named Theron, pulled her aside. His voice was low, urgent. He knew her secret, had known since she joined, but had valued her skill over tradition. Now, he warned her, the camp was a tinderbox, and Calchas' words were a spark. She must tread carefully, or her deed would become her death. That night, Lysara could not sleep. She sat by a dying fire, sharpening her blade, her mind racing. The camp felt like a trap, its tents and palisades closing in. She thought of her father, his lessons of honor, and her mother, who spoke of Artemis' fierce protection. But the gods were silent now, and Lysara knew she could rely only on her own strength. She resolved to prove her worth, to silence the whispers with deeds, not words. The opportunity came sooner than expected. At dawn, a Trojan war party struck the camp's eastern edge, their chariots thundering through the mist. The Greeks scrambled to form lines, their shields locking as arrows fell like hail. Lysara joined the Myrmidons, her spear in hand, her heart steady despite the chaos. The battle was brutal, the ground slick with blood and mud. She fought at the forefront, her blade carving through Trojan ranks, her shield deflecting blows that would have felled lesser warriors. In the melee, she glimpsed Agamemnon, his chariot gleaming as he rallied his men. A Trojan archer, hidden in the scrub, drew his bow, the arrow aimed at the king's back. Lysara acted without thought, sprinting through the fray, her shield raised. The arrow struck the bronze with a clang, the force knocking her to her knees. Agamemnon turned, his eyes meeting hers again, but this time, there was no gratitude, only a flicker of fear. The battle ended with the Trojans driven back, their chariots retreating toward Troy's distant walls. The Greeks cheered, but Lysara felt the weight of eyes upon her. Her second act of valor had not gone unnoticed, but it deepened the rift in the camp. Calchas seized the moment, proclaiming that her presence defied the natural order, that her deeds were an affront to Zeus. The seer's words spread like wildfire, fanned by fear and superstition. By dusk, Lysara was summoned again to Agamemnon's pavilion. This time, the air was thicker, the tension a blade at her throat. The king's face was a mask of conflict, torn between honor and the demands of his men. Calchas stood beside him, his eyes gleaming with triumph. The counselors murmured of sacrifice, of appeasing the gods to end the war's curse. Lysara's heart pounded, but she held her ground, her voice steady as she demanded to know her crime. Agamemnon's response was a blow. He declared her a danger, her disguise a deception that threatened the army's unity. Her deeds, though heroic, could not outweigh the risk of divine wrath. The decision was made: Lysara would face trial, her fate to be decided by the Council of Kings. As she was led away, her wrists bound with rawhide, the camp watched in chaos, torn between awe of her courage and fear of her truth. The Achaean camp simmered under a blood-red dawn, its air thick with the stench of sacrifice and fear. Lysara, the Myrmidon warrior who had twice saved Agamemnon's life, stood bound in the heart of the Greek encampment, her wrists chafed raw by rawhide cords. The Council of Kings had gathered, their bronze armor glinting in the firelight, their voices a low rumble of judgment. This was no mere trial, it was a spectacle, a ritual to appease the gods and silence the whispers that threatened the fragile unity of the Greek forces. The siege of Troy had stretched into its 10th year, and the men were weary, their spirits frayed by hunger, disease, and the unyielding walls of their enemy. Lysara's trial was held in a clearing near Agamemnon's pavilion, where a crude platform of driftwood had been erected. The High King sat at its center, his face a mask of authority, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. To his left was Calchas, the seer, whose skeletal frame seemed to carry the weight of divine wrath. To his right sat Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, his gaze sharp and unreadable. The other kings, Diomedes, Menelaus, Nestor, formed a semicircle, their men crowding behind, a sea of spears and shields. The Myrmidons stood apart, their silence heavy, their loyalty to Lysara clashing with their fear of the gods. Calchas spoke first, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. He declared Lysara's disguise a blasphemy, a woman's presence in the ranks an insult to Zeus and Ares. Her deeds, though heroic, were unnatural, he claimed, pointing to the stalled war as proof of divine displeasure. The crowd stirred, some nodding, others muttering in dissent. Lysara's gaze remained steady, her jaw clenched, her cropped hair damp with sweat. She knew the truth, her skill had saved lives, but her existence challenged the order of their world. Odysseus rose, his voice calm but commanding. He acknowledged Lysara's valor, recounting how her spear had felled the Trojan who aimed for Agamemnon's heart. Yet he wove a subtle trap, suggesting that her secrecy sowed distrust among the ranks. The army needed unity, he argued, and her presence was a spark in a dry field. The Myrmidons bristled, but none spoke. Theron, Lysara's captain, stood with arms crossed, his face a storm of conflict. He had vouched for her, trained her, but now his silence was a blade at her back. Lysara was given a chance to speak. Her voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of a warrior who had faced death and lived. She recounted her years among the Myrmidons, her father's lessons, her mother's tales of Artemis. She had fought not for glory, but for survival, for the honor of her people. She asked the council to judge her by her deeds, not her birth. A few soldiers cheered, but Calchas' glare silenced them. Agamemnon's face darkened, torn between gratitude and the pressure of his men. The trial paused as a commotion erupted at the camp's edge. A Trojan raid, smaller but bolder than the last, struck the southern palisades. The council hesitated, but Lysara's voice cut through the chaos. She demanded a chance to prove her worth, to fight as a Myrmidon one last time. Agamemnon, perhaps seeing a way to delay judgment, nodded. Her bonds were cut, and she seized a spear, her eyes blazing with defiance. The Myrmidons rallied behind her, their shouts drowning out Calchas' protests. The raid was a slaughter. The Trojans, led by a captain with a lion pelt cloak, fought with desperate fury, their blades carving through the Greek lines. Lysara moved like a shadow, her spear a blur, her shield battered but unyielding. She saved Theron from a chariot's charge, her blade severing the driver's arm. The Myrmidons drove the Trojans back, their cheers echoing as the enemy fled. Lysara stood amidst the carnage, blood-streaked, her chest heaving, her eyes locked on Agamemnon, who had watched from a distance. But her triumph was short-lived. As the dust settled, Calchas seized the moment, declaring her victory a further sign of her unnatural power. He spun tales of witches and curses, his words poisoning the air. The crowd, once divided, began to sway, fear outweighing admiration. Agamemnon, pressured by the seer and the murmurs of his men, declared the trial would resume at dusk. Lysara was bound again, her spear taken, her fate hanging like a storm cloud. As she was led to a guarded tent, Theron slipped through the crowd, his face grim. He whispered of a plan, a desperate bid to save her. The Myrmidons, loyal to their own, were ready to act, but the cost would be high. Lysara nodded, her heart heavy. She had fought for honor, but now she faced a choice: submit to the gods' so-called will or defy the kings who sought to erase her. The sun sank low, painting the Achaean camp in shades of fire and shadow. Lysara sat in a guarded tent, its canvas walls stained with smoke and blood. Her wrists ached, bound once more, but her mind was sharp, honed by years of survival. The trial's resumption loomed, and the air was thick with the scent of betrayal. Outside, the camp buzzed with whispers. Some called her a hero, others a curse. The Myrmidons, her brothers in arms, were her only shield, but even they were divided, torn between loyalty and fear of divine wrath. Theron's whispered plan lingered in her mind. A small group of Myrmidons, led by him, would attempt to free her under cover of night, smuggling her to a fishing boat hidden along the shore. From there, she could flee to Phthia, where her mother's kin might shelter her. But the cost was steep. Desertion meant death for those caught, and the Myrmidons would face Agamemnon's wrath. Lysara weighed the choice, her heart torn between her own survival and the lives of those who stood by her. As dusk fell, the trial resumed. The clearing was lit by torches, their flames casting jagged shadows on the faces of the kings. Agamemnon's voice was heavy, his words measured. He spoke of duty, of the need to appease the gods to end the war. Calchas stood beside him, his eyes gleaming like a vulture's, reciting omens of storms and blood. He demanded Lysara's death, claiming her sacrifice would lift the curse on the Greek cause. The crowd roared, some in anger, others in fear, their voices a chaotic tide. Odysseus spoke again, his words a labyrinth of reason and deception. He proposed a compromise: banishment instead of death, sending Lysara to a distant isle where her presence would no longer threaten the army. But Calchas rejected it, his voice rising to a fevered pitch, accusing Odysseus of defying the gods. The tension snapped like a bowstring when a Myrmidon warrior, unable to hold his tongue, shouted in Lysara's defense. The crowd surged, fists raised, and for a moment, it seemed the camp would tear itself apart. Agamemnon raised his hand, silencing the chaos. His decision was final: Lysara would face execution at dawn, her body offered to Artemis to cleanse the camp of its curse. The Myrmidons roared in protest, their spears clashing against shields, but Agamemnon's guards formed a wall, their blades drawn. Lysara was led away, her head high, her eyes burning with defiance. She would not beg, would not break, even as the weight of her fate pressed down. In the dead of night, Theron's plan unfolded. The guards at her tent were Myrmidons in disguise, their loyalty to Lysara outweighing their fear of Agamemnon. They cut her bonds, handing her a dagger and a cloak. The camp was quiet, the men exhausted from the day's chaos, but danger lurked in every shadow. Lysara moved silently, her steps light, her heart pounding. The shore was close, the boat waiting, but a cry pierced the night. A sentry had spotted them. The escape turned into a desperate fight. Theron and his men formed a shield around Lysara, their blades flashing in the moonlight. Agamemnon's guards pursued, their shouts echoing across the camp. Lysara fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf, her dagger finding flesh, her cloak torn by a spear's graze. They reached the shore, the boat bobbing in the dark waves, but Theron fell, a spear in his back, his blood staining the sand. Lysara's scream was swallowed by the wind as she was pushed toward the boat. She hesitated, torn between flight and vengeance, but the surviving Myrmidons urged her on. The boat rocked as she climbed aboard, her hands gripping the oars. The guards reached the shore, their torches blazing, but the current was swift, carrying her into the night. The camp faded, its fires mere pinpricks, and Lysara was alone, the sea her only witness. She rowed until her arms burned, her heart heavy with Theron's sacrifice and the weight of her uncertain fate. By dawn, the boat reached a rocky cove, far from Troy's shadow. Lysara stumbled ashore, her body bruised, her spirit unbroken. She knew Agamemnon's reach was long, and Calchas' words would follow her like a curse. The war was not over, and neither was her fight. She vowed to return, to carve her name into the annals of history, not as a victim, but as a warrior who defied the gods and kings. The horizon stretched before her, vast and unforgiving, promising both danger and redemption. The sea stretched endless and merciless, a gray expanse that swallowed Lysara's small boat as she rowed through the dawn. Her arms burned, her hands blistered from the oars, but her heart burned fiercer still. Theron's death, the Myrmidon's sacrifice, and the betrayal of Agamemnon's camp fueled her resolve. She was no longer the disguised warrior of Phthia. She was a fugitive, marked by the Achaean kings and cursed by Calchas' venomous tongue. Yet, in the solitude of the waves, Lysara vowed to return to Troy, not as a victim, but as a force to carve her truth into the blood-soaked annals of the war. The cove where she landed was a jagged scar of rock and salt, far from the Achaean camp. She hid the boat beneath a tangle of driftwood and seaweed, her cloak torn but her dagger still sharp at her side. The land was rugged, dotted with scrub and caves, a place where outcasts and deserters might lurk. Lysara moved like a hunted animal, her senses honed, her steps silent. She knew Agamemnon's scouts would search for her, driven by Calchas' insistence that her death was the god's demand. But she also knew the war's chaos offered shadows to hide within. Days bled into weeks as Lysara survived on fish and rainwater, her body hardening, her mind sharpening. She found refuge in a cave overlooking the sea, its walls etched with ancient carvings of hunters and gods. There, she prayed to Artemis, the huntress who favored the defiant, offering a lock of her hair as tribute. The goddess seemed to answer, for Lysara's strength grew, her wounds healed, and her path became clear. She would not flee to Phthia. She would return to Troy, infiltrate the war, and expose the lies that condemned her. Her chance came with a band of Thracian mercenaries, late arrivals to the Greek cause, their ships anchoring near her cove. They were rough men, their armor patched, their spears stained with the blood of distant battles. Lysara approached them at dusk, her voice low, her stance confident. She claimed to be a deserter, a Myrmidon seeking vengeance against Agamemnon. The Thracian leader, a scarred giant named Cleitos, laughed at her audacity but saw the fire in her eyes. He offered her a place among them, mistaking her for a youth. Lysara accepted, binding her chest tighter, her cropped hair hidden beneath a stolen helm. The Thracians joined the Achaean camp, their tents pitched on its fringes, distrusted by the Greeks but valued for their ferocity. Lysara kept her head down, her spear ready, her identity buried beneath grime and silence. The camp had changed in her absence. The air was heavier, the men gaunt, the siege faltering. Achilles had returned to battle, his wrath unleashed, but even his victories could not breach Troy's walls. Whispers of Lysara's escape lingered, twisted into tales of a witch who cursed the Greeks. Calchas fanned these fears, his sacrifices growing bloodier, his omens darker. Lysara's first test came during a night raid on a Trojan supply line. The Thracians struck swiftly, their blades cutting through the enemy's guards. Lysara fought with precision, her spear finding throats and hearts, her movements a dance of death. She saved Cleitos from an arrow, earning his grudging respect. But her eyes were on the Achaean camp, searching for a way to reach Agamemnon, to confront the king who had sentenced her to die. Her opportunity arose during a rare council of war, called to plan a desperate assault on Troy's western gate. The Thracians were tasked with guarding the perimeter, and Lysara volunteered, her heart pounding. She slipped through the shadows, her cloak blending with the night, until she reached Agamemnon's pavilion. The king stood among his counselors, his face haggard, his voice strained. Calchas was there, his eyes darting as if sensing a threat. Lysara's dagger felt heavy at her side, but she held back, knowing a blade would not undo the lies that condemned her. Instead, she listened, learning of a plan to sacrifice a captive Trojan princess to appease Artemis. The cruelty of it steeled her resolve. She would not let another woman die to sate the god's supposed wrath. She returned to the Thracians, her mind racing. Cleitos, sensing her restlessness, pressed her for the truth. Lysara revealed her identity, her voice steady, her eyes daring him to betray her. To her surprise, Cleitos laughed, calling her a warrior worth 10 kings. He pledged his men to her cause, their loyalty bought by her courage. The night of the sacrifice arrived, the camp lit by torches, the air thick with chants. Lysara and the Thracians struck, their blades silent, their movements swift. They freed the Trojan princess, a girl no older than 15, and fled into the chaos. The camp erupted, guards shouting, horns blaring. Lysara led the charge, her spear a beacon, her voice a war cry that rallied the Thracians. They fought their way to the shore, where a stolen boat waited, but Agamemnon's men closed in, their bronze gleaming in the firelight. The shore was a battlefield, the sand slick with blood, the waves crashing like the god's own fury. Lysara stood at the forefront, her spear splintered, her dagger slick with crimson. The Thracians fought around her, their shouts mingling with the screams of Agamemnon's guards. The Trojan princess, trembling but unharmed, clung to Cleitos, who wielded his axe like a reaper. The stolen boat rocked in the surf, salvation tantalizingly close, but the Achaeans pressed harder, their numbers swelling as the camp awoke to the betrayal. Lysara's eyes met Agamemnon's across the chaos. The High King, clad in golden armor, stood atop a dune, his sword raised, his face twisted with rage. Beside him was Calchas, his robes flapping like a vulture's wings, his voice shrieking of divine retribution. Lysara knew this was her moment, not for vengeance, but for truth. She shouted her name, her voice carrying over the din, declaring her deeds, the spear that saved Agamemnon, the shield that spared him again, the courage that defied their lies. The Achaeans faltered, some lowering their weapons, their eyes wide with doubt. Calchas screamed for her death, but Lysara charged, her dagger flashing. She fought not for survival, but for her story to live. She reached the seer, her blade grazing his arm before a guard's spear caught her side. Pain seared through her, but she stood, blood streaming, her eyes locked on Agamemnon. The king hesitated, his sword trembling, as the camp watched, torn between fear and awe. Odysseus, ever the weaver of words, stepped forward, calling for a truce, his voice cutting through the madness. The fighting ceased, the air heavy with the stench of blood and salt. Lysara swayed, her strength fading, but her gaze held Agamemnon's. She spoke of honor, of the gods who valued courage over birth, of the war that devoured truth to feed pride. Her words struck like arrows, and even Calchas fell silent, his power waning. Agamemnon's face softened, guilt flickering in his eyes, but the weight of his crown pressed heavier. He ordered her seized, her fate to be decided at dawn. The Thracians, outnumbered, surrendered, their loyalty to Lysara unbroken. She was bound, her wounds untreated, and led to a tent under heavy guard. The princess was returned to Troy, a gesture of peace, but Lysara's fate remained a wound in the camp. That night, Odysseus visited her, his eyes weary. He spoke of her courage but also of the war's cost. He offered no promises, only a truth. Her story had spread, a spark that could not be extinguished. Dawn came, and Lysara faced her final judgment. The council gathered, the camp silent, the air thick with prophecy and fear. Agamemnon, pressured by Calchas' dwindling influence and the murmurs of his men, declared her sentence, death by stoning, her name erased from the annals. But as the first stone was raised, a cry rose from the Myrmidons, who had slipped back into the camp. They formed a shield wall, their spears gleaming, their voices chanting Lysara's name. The camp fractured, soldiers clashing, brother against brother. Lysara, freed in the chaos, fought with her last strength, her dagger a fong of defiance. She reached Agamemnon, her blade at his throat, but she did not strike. Instead, she demanded her story be told, her deeds carved into stone, her truth honored. The king, faced with her unyielding spirit, nodded, his voice breaking. He spared her life, banishing her to a distant land, her name to live in whispers. Lysara sailed away, her wounds bandaged, her heart heavy but unbroken. The Thracians followed, their loyalty a shield against the world. She landed on a rocky isle, its cliffs defiant against the sea. There, she built a life, training warriors, honoring Artemis, her story a beacon for those who dared defy fate. Years later, when Troy fell, its flames lit the horizon, and Lysara watched, knowing her truth had outlived the war. Her tale lived on, carved into stone by those who remembered, whispered by bards who defied kings. The Achaeans spoke of a warrior who saved their king, whose courage shamed their pride, whose name was Lysara. On quiet nights, when the sea sang, her island echoed with her laughter, a sound that mocked gods and men alike. Her legacy endured, not in the songs of poets, but in the hearts of those who fought for truth, their blades sharp, their spirits fierce, their stories eternal.